Good. All right. How many of these webinars do you give, like, say, a month, Doug?
Depends on which month it is. But in, well, like this week, starting last Friday, I don't know. It's almost every day. Yeah,
Wow, that's amazing.
almost every day. Out of the 31 days in a month, probably 28 of them.
That's incredible. Yeah,
Yeah, I can't
yeah,
keep up with it. I mean, so that's good.
that is. I wonder how many people you've reached, you know?
The Zoom.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
did I did one in Florida for Florida Audubon. There were 1,700 people on there,
Oh, that's great.
and in Ohio for the, I guess it was Master Gardeners, there were 1,500 and
That's
somebody.
fabulous.
Yeah, most of them are smaller, but you
Yeah,
you couldn't get that many people in a room. So
I know. Yeah.
I'm hitting
That's
a lot
really
more people
good.
by staying home than when I was traveling.
Well, there is something to be said for Zoom. I mean, there is,
Yeah,
and I think there's an intensity to it that's different, you know?
yeah, it's more it's more personable than I ever thought it would be.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
estimated the amount of time that would spend in a normal year just going to the university. It's only 12 miles.
Uh-huh.
And in the course of a year, it was a week of my time sitting in a car
Yeah, wow.
with a small commute. People commute hours. It's
Right,
we're
right.
spending our life just doing nothing. So I
Yeah,
don't know.
I agree. So, Mary, what do you
Oh,
say? Should we start?
yes, I would think so.
Okay,
Um,
all right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Anne Raver, and I'm just welcoming you all here today. And you probably all know Doug Tallamy by now. You've probably listened to a webinar or seen him lecture, and I'm going to jump right into a conversation with Doug because we've all been doing our homework, Doug. Most people have read your books and explored your new website. It's very interesting. And I just want to remind everybody what a star we have here. Dr. Ptolemy has been teaching at the University of Delaware in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Biology for some 40 years, I think. And his first book, Bringing Nature Home, came out in 2007. And since then, it sounds to me as if he's been crisscrossing the country tirelessly, aside from researching and teaching, getting the word out, which was a revelation to me basically in 2007 that native plants, yes, I love them, but they are key to our survival, and that if you don't have caterpillars, the birds will starve, and so will we eventually. That's something we'll be talking about in more detail. And as Doug's research has continued, it's amazing all the different things that you point out, Doug. So one thing that that we'll get to. First, I wanted to talk about some of your strategies that you talk about for our own gardens, but also, of course, we want to talk to you about how we get the word across to our neighbors. I have a pretty wild landscape now, and I would say it's gorgeous, but it does look messy to some of my neighbors who are still out there spraying the 5 dandelions on the clipped lawn and, clipping their barberries, even though they're escaping into the woods. So, when I try to have conversation with some people, their eyes cross literally. And so I think that's a big topic for all of us. And also, just to let you know, you may already know this. We have a little group within RIPS that is meeting, and they're trying to brainstorm about how to plant some of these, what they call health strips, or I think of as the tree belt along towns, and start to generate some interest among the less fanatical people like us. So anyway, I love your idea. First of all, the land owning for those of us who do own property is not just a privilege; it's a responsibility, and that we're all conservationists. So I wanted to ask you about our general attitude about shall we start with our gardens and then do we worry about our neighbors?
Uh, yes, we got to get our own house in order before we start worrying about other people. But the how do we we're talking about changing the culture, and changing culture is very hard. And you're competing with the marketing culture, because if you turn on the TV, the man tells you have to spray your dandelion or you're not a good person, and you have to spend a lot of money on fertilizers and herbicides and everything else because that's what we do. And so you're competing with that. And of course, if you don't do that, you don't fit in with the other neighbors. So you're all of a sudden a rebel. And a lot of people don't want to, they don't want to be rebels. So these are all stumbling blocks. And it's, that question is the most difficult one. How do we convince people? That's why I write the books. That's why I do these webinars and discussions. It's the challenge is to convince people that plants are more than decorations. If they're only decorations, then we can treat them that way. You don't want anything touching them, certainly not an insect, and that all makes sense. But once people realize that they're more than decorations, they are decorations, but they're essential components of functioning ecosystems, and we humans aren't going to do well without functioning ecosystems. And the more species that are in those ecosystems, the better they function. If we could internalize what 7.9 billion people, what that number means and what they are doing to the planet, you'd realize we need more ecosystem services now than ever before. So taking huge pieces of the planet and making sure that nothing happens on those pieces, it's just not an option anymore. You look at your lawn and say, oh, there's my lawn, it's pretty, and so I've got the status symbol, I'm a good neighbor, but it's an ecological dead zone. And we've got more than 40 million acres of that in this country, which is bigger than New England. So can we afford to do that anymore? No, it's a matter of broadening your perspective about what you as an individual, how you treat the earth, and then add it all up. And that's where we run into trouble. If you were the only one doing whatever, it'd be fine. But you're not. You're one of 7.8 billion. And I don't know. I could just ramble on and on, Anne. I mean, there's.
Okay. Well, I have some specific questions about that later on, but let's go into some of these really interesting strategies that you propose for our own gardens. And one, of course, is the keystone species idea. I think your first book, when I read it, you did mention this or talk about it, but I think I was thinking, well, if I just plant natives in my garden, right, that'll be great. Well, it's better than non-natives, but those oaks and black cherries and other plants are truly key. Could you talk about that? Like, why are they so important?
Yeah, when I read Bringing Nature Home, I actually wrote it in 2005, and we had ideas about what was happening, but we had not really put the keystone species concept together. Native was it. Native is going to be better than non-native, and we'll be happy with that. But when we started looking at our own data, we realized that there's just 5% of our native plant species generating 75% of the caterpillar food. 14% are generating 90%. So there's 85% of our native plants that in terms of sustaining food webs aren't doing that much. And you say, well, who cares about caterpillars? Caterpillars transfer more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of creature. So if you design a landscape with no caterpillars, the energy stays locked up in the plant, for the most part, which means then you don't have, that's the first trophic level. You don't have higher trophic levels. So you don't have animal diversity in your yard, which means you have a very depauperate ecosystem. And that's when it all starts to crumble in on itself. So we have to get that energy. It's energy from the sun that drives life on this planet. And if it stays locked up in plants, it's not doing us any good. That's where the caterpillars come in, and that's where the keystone plants come in, because they are by far the best at supporting those caterpillars. And in 85%, 84% of the counties in North America, oaks are the #1 keystone genus. They support over 900 species of caterpillars nationwide.
That's amazing. And then black cherries also.
Black cherry is #2. Well, Prunus, the genus Prunus.
Okay. So chokecherry.
So chokecherry and beach plum, American plum. Yeah.
Good to know. And then the willows are very.
Willows are right there with cherries. And, you know, this varies a little bit as you move around the country. When you go really far north, oaks actually drop out. There aren't any oaks, but that's when willows are #1. They take over.
Interesting. There are many species of them, aren't there? The low ones and the bush ones and the trees.
There are 90 some species of oaks and almost as I think 80 some species of willows, or maybe it's 126 species of willows. There's a lot.
Well, and I think as a gardener, I always thought, well, willow, my land is pretty dry. I couldn't grow a willow, but there are probably species that would do fine in a dry.
A lot of the plants that can do well in wet situations, like winterberry and clethra, buttonbush. They don't need the water. It's just that they can handle it when it's there, and that's true for a lot of willows as well. I mean, look at weeping willow. Look at where people plant them everywhere.
Right.
It doesn't, it'll do fine in water, but it doesn't need it.
Well, and then your point that there are certain perennials that are really important, especially the asters and the goldenrods.
Right.
So if we had those, we could feel pretty good about our caterpillar.
Right. So generating caterpillar food for the food web is really important, but we also have to deal with those pollinators, because it's the pollinator community, and it's largely our native bees that's keeping the flowering plants around, like 90% of the flowering plants. So we can, and we're actually doing this. We're generating keystone pollinator species too, and they're going to be different plants. Because oaks are wind pollinated. They're not. There are pollinators that go and eat oak pollen, but by and large, they're not supporting the pollinator community. But things like goldenrod and the several genera of asters and sunflowers and enethera, violets, they're all very high in terms of not just supporting caterpillars, but also supporting the specialist pollinators. So then that's what we want to target if we're supporting pollinators, is the specialists, because the generalists like honeybees and bumblebees, they go to a lot of different flowers, including our 9-day flower. They're just looking for nectar for the most part.
So we don't have to worry too much about, they're not that particular, though some of them are, because of their noses or
their mouth parts. Bumblebees are good at deep corolla flowers, but if you plant for the specialist, you will satisfy the needs of the generalist.
Okay. Now, another big point that I loved about your latest book is, you say you can't just plant that oak. Maybe you have 4 oaks, but if you have the lawn coming up to the oak, or maybe you have periwinkle coming up to the oak, that might be a little better, but you've got to feed these invertebrates during their pupa stage, like after they get nice and fat munching the leaves. So could you talk about that?
Right. I actually have some slides on that.
Oh, wonderful.
So let me screen share.
Okay.
Actually, if we're talking about oaks, these first pictures here are just species that use oaks in my yard. I've got I think it's 265 species of moths that use oaks in my yard. So it's a lot of them. But this is one, the solitary oak leaf miner, and this is one of the Hesperiids, the skippers, the juveniles, dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar. Some of them are really pretty. two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger
Oh
moth, the
my God.
streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species are on the oaks.
So Doug, could I ask you one thing before you go on? Like, first of all, could you say that really, really fast? How fast can you say the names? I'm just kidding.
Faster than that.
But you know, when I like, how do you see all these things? I mean, I stand in front of my white oak and I'm like, I don't see anything.
You know, somebody asked me a question the other day. They said, how do you take pictures of the caterpillars when they're at the top of the tree with your camera? I said, well, I bring them down out of the top of the tree.
But really,
You don't.
how do you observe so many things? I think we all would love to be able to do that.
It's called developing a search image. I know what they look like, so I know what I'm looking for. You know, have you ever lost a contact lens on the rug? In the beginning, you can't find it at all. But all of a sudden you see a glint and then you learn, oh, this is what it looks like on the rug. And the next time you lose, you can find it much faster. That's the way it is with caterpillars. I know their tricks. I know where they're hiding.
Okay.
I know when to look for them.
We'll have to take a class on that. All right, so I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
All right. Now you had asked if I show the life cycle of one of these.
Right.
All right.
So
This is the yellow neck caterpillar. That's the eggs. And right away, as soon as they lay the eggs, within minutes of laying the eggs, here's a parasitoid, a little tiny wasp that's going to lay its eggs in many of these. So they have lots of enemies out there that knock down their numbers. Can you see the wasp right there?
Yes. And how big is the egg in the real life?
Well, tiny, head of a pin.
Okay.
So, all right. So that's what the eggs look like. That's what the caterpillars look like, the yellow neck.
Mm-hmm.
They feed gregariously because they're eating, it's usually the first week in August, and the leaves are really tough at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So they all get together and they do it together. That's what the adult looks like. It's one of the Daytana moths, and that's what the pupa looks like underground. They wiggle beneath the ground to form a pupa. And that brings us to the next topic, and that is, if you don't landscape under the trees appropriately, when those caterpillars drop out of the tree, they can't wiggle beneath the ground. It's too compacted. A lot of species spin their cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree, but we don't landscape that way. So this becomes an ecological trap where we call in species to use the leaves and then they drop down and die. And of course, the cement landscape isn't going to work either. This is what most people do. You got a tree in a yard, and we don't know what the survivorship of caterpillars is with a situation like this, but I guarantee it's better with a situation like this, where you have a tree, maybe a dogwood here, a layered landscape, you know, a native azalea, ferns. This is a safe site. Those caterpillars can drop down, they wiggle beneath the ground. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to step on them. It's a great place to do your spring ephemeral gardening. And it's also a great way to reduce the area that's in lawn, because now this is not lawn right up the tree. Your mower's not going to bang into it. And it helps nutrient cycling for the tree roots. This is why you don't have to fertilize your trees. The leaves that fall nestle right in here, and they compost, and the nutrients return to the soil, and it all goes over and over again, and you don't need to do anything. But it's also a safe site for those caterpillars. It's also a great place to use your ground covers, like wild ginger here, or mayapple, or foam flower, or ferns. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia, but this is all a safe site. Any caterpillar that develops up here can make it when you landscape like this. So you don't have to have lawn. There are alternatives. So.
You know, I think, Doug, it's so great to see these pictures. I think I get hung up on, well, gosh, do I have to match the ground covers to the species of tree? You know, here's the oak, and does it need a certain kind of fern, or, you know, what?
No. You have to match the needs of the plant to the soil that you have. Mm-hmm. So you can't try to force an acid-loving fern in a highly basic soil, but.
Right. So just relax about that then.
Yeah, relax. You will know if it doesn't work. They'll die. And then you say, well, I'll try something else. But
oh, right.
Yeah, and it's not as, don't make it harder than it is. You know?
Yeah, well, that's good. So also, I'm realizing, like my husband Rock is always saying, look, that vinca, the periwinkle, that's covering that space under the winter berries. Let's not worry about it now. Let's worry about this other part of the garden. But you're saying remove that vinca because it's an invasive plant. And because, is it true that there are a lot of little insects under there that are not, that they would like to eat a ground cover if I had it, a native ground cover if I had it?
Right. I mean, Rock is right in that the vinca is creating the same type of safe site for those caterpillars that fall out of the tree as these other things. But the vinca plant itself is not contributing. It's one of those where the energy is locked up in the leaves because none of the insects, there are no insects that specialize and eat vinca. There are insects that specialize on ferns. There are insects that eat all those other plants. Not many, but they're contributing.
Okay.
There are also many of those, like particularly our spring ephemerals, are really important for early season bees because they flower before the leaves are out on the trees.
Very good. That's great. Now, I want to get to something. Doug and I were chatting about this before three, and he and Cindy, his wife, have 10 acres in Oxford, PA, which was an old hay field, right? Covered with invasives when they moved in. How
Yeah,
many years ago? 20 years
this
ago.
is our 20th year. Yeah,
So, and how many moth species are you up to now? Like 1,000 or something?
1,031.
That's amazing.
And the interesting thing is that's so far.
Oh,
So last year I added over 200 species. You know why? Because I was home because of COVID.
oh,
I had a lot more time to collect moths.
lucky man. Yeah.
Yeah. So
So,
we have not topped out. I mean, there's still more species I haven't found for sure.
so those moths, um, you know, first of all, I thought, well, why is Doug counting the moths and not the butterflies?
Well,
Because,
I just haven't gotten the butterflies yet.
oh, okay, but I think a lot of us don't even think about the moths.
Right.
Well, I'm sure some of our serious members do who know a lot about insects, but I always think about the butterflies. And then when I started thinking about the moths and how gorgeous they are and how I'd like to see them, I think, oh, I'm in a killing fields for the moths because we are surrounded by street lights, which when we moved in 2016, we started to complain to the town council. We even went and testified and they were like, yeah, we're getting to that. We're gonna fix that. You know, how many years later? 5 years later, they're still as bright as ever. Also, we live across from a school, the parking lot, and they have one of these high intensity lights. It's not an emotion sensor. It's blinding
Yeah.
when you get
Mercury vapor lamp. It's the
yeah.
worst you can do.
And so I think, oh, great. You know, we're doing all that we can in our yard, but these poor moths. First of all, tell what happens to the moths or
Uh,
the
well, night light pollution kills moths in about 10 different ways through exhaustion because they fly around and around and around and around until they just run out of steam. Incineration, they smash into it, collisions, and those lights are white hot. It attracts bats, nowhere to hunt, so they just come and they pick off the insects around there. The bright lights blind a lot of our night insects. Who knew that? So after they're exposed to it, they're blind, and what can they do then? And it keeps them from doing what they ought to be doing. They should be flying around the night with no lights, mating, laying eggs, doing what they're here to do, instead of sitting on the wall of your house. If they don't die from the light itself, they're sitting there. And then in the morning, the birds that love these things, they know where to hunt too. So they come and pick them off. So bright lights typically are a one-way trip for a moth. And look at the night lights of the US. They're everywhere. They're everywhere.
Do they actually pollinate? Do moths pollinate plants?
Well, we have there's about 14,000 species of moths in the US. And many of them are important pollinators. So if you go out at night with your flashlight, look at your milkweed when it's in bloom at night, or your buttonbush when it's in bloom at night, and it's not covered with bees, it's covered with moths. So they do a lot more pollination than they ever got credit for. They're not as, they're not as good as our native bees, which are specialized for that. But you put 14,000 species together and it adds up. And there are plants that depend entirely on them, like basswood, for example. That's a moth-pollinated plant. There are a number of them.
Yeah.
So yes, they're important for that. And you know what's funny? Butterflies aren't. So the monarch has become a poster child for saving our pollinators. Well, the monarch doesn't pollinate anything.
Oh, really?
It's a flower visitor, and it goes to get the nectar. But
it's the moths that are pollinating the Asclepias.
Well, moths and bumblebees are very good at it too. They have those pollinia that have to.
Yeah.
They latch onto the legs of big insects. Bumblebees are very good at that.
Yeah, we love the bumblebees. Well, so I think we should hop to the greater neighborhood now and talk about how do I, sort of help other people get this flash of revelation. I mean, I think people, of course, hate to be lectured to. They don't even want to get into a chat. Like when some of my neighbors say, "Wow, that is gorgeous. What is that?" And I say, "Oh, that's the butterfly weed." And I talk about it. Well, their eyes start to glaze over and they're drifting off. See you later. But and our people, we have a committee that they're thinking of getting a plant kit together of plugs so that they can sell it to interested people who can then plant part of the, outside on the tree belt, or, something very simple that would be easy and maybe get them excited. And I started thinking, well, maybe we should try to plant oaks in those tree belts and do a kind of layered landscape thing. But how do we start, or should we go to the schools with a little, talk for sixth graders? Like, Doug,
Right.
that's your next inspired thing. Like,
I get that request all the
on?
time. Yeah.
How do we?
Before we move there, Anne, let's finish up the lights because we have to tell people what to do now.
Okay.
So you can put your lights on a motion sensor, so it only turns on when the bad man comes.
Right.
But the big thing is to take that white light out and put in a yellow bulb, and a yellow LED bulb is the most effective. So you can still have your light at night, but yellow wavelengths are not attractive to the moths. So there are solutions to this. It's not black or white, as it were. I mean, you really can have a light on at night if you're more comfortable with that, but make it the appropriate bulb, and a motion sensor is best.
Excuse me, Doug. I think you're speaking to the choir now. That they really, I would be surprised if I could see a raise of hands or whatever. Probably most people listening do not have white lights, or that it's shaded or it's yellow, but how do we communicate that knowledge to our neighbors who have the blinding light on the either side of the porch, and my school across the street? Really, I think is this where we've got to get more active? We have to go to the town hall. We have to go to our neighbor association.
This is where the terrible headlines we're seeing repeatedly in the major media are helping. So most people have heard about insect apocalypse, the global insect decline and how it's going to hurt us. And the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species in the next 20 years. The National Wildlife, or the World Wildlife Fund, says we've already lost 2/3 of our wildlife. These are scary headlines, and people, they want to know what they can do. So the response is there is something you can do to help all of these things. Most of those insects that we're going to lose, or most of those species, that 1 million species, will be insects. insects are the little things that run the world. You know, we've got data to explain to people why this is important. And that's why I write the books and do
Right.
all that stuff. But
Well, as Mary O'Connor was saying, we have to start learning to love our insects, that most of us were brought up to think, oh God, get away. What is that? Kill that, you know.
yeah, yeah,
And even gardeners, I think we need to fall in love with the insects more and to wonder where they came from. What's their
yeah,
life cycle?
yeah. Well, this is, knowledge generates interest.
Mhm.
And this is where learning a little bit about what's happening. So that brings me actually to the next book I have written. It's called The Nature of Oaks. And I
Yeah.
wrote it for exactly that reason.
Wow.
Um,
Tell us about
hey,
that.
here,
Yeah.
here it is. It's right
Yeah.
here. I just got a copy. It comes out at the end of March. But what it does is follow the various species that use the oaks in my yard every month of the year,
Oh, wonderful.
so that you can walk outside if you have an oak and say, okay, it's April. This is what I should be finding, and this is where I should look.
Oh,
So you realize your oak tree it's not just a tree.
uh-huh.
And you realize all the things that it's doing.
Yeah.
So it's an entire community, and it's a vital community to the health of your local ecosystem. And that kind of knowledge will empower you to say, my goodness, I need more than one oak because these are really important plants.
Well, I love your idea of planting in groves too. I mean,
Right,
you might touch on that a bit. Like we could just
right.
plant smaller caliber trees together because why?
Well, because horticulture has always focused on the aesthetics. And if you plant an isolated tree, it reaches its full majestic glory. And if you plant it close to another tree, there's competition, so it won't get as big. Um, but there's a real benefit here. When you plant in tree groves, the roots of the trees are allowed to lock in with each other the way they do in a forest.
Mm-hmm.
So when the derecho comes and the hurricane comes and the ground is saturated and all these giant trees fall over and crush your house, that doesn't happen anymore. You have to plant them young though, so that the roots can grow together, but you ought to be planting your trees young anyway. Planting a 15-foot oak it's a terrible waste of money. And there's a really good chance that oak will die in 10 years anyway, because you've had to root prune it so much. So then you appreciate the grove of trees as the aesthetic instead of the isolated individual.
I like that idea. That might be a good idea for public spaces too, as
Yeah,
think
absolutely.
about how to spread the word and so forth. I think maybe we should open up the to general questions. Mary, what do you think? And if we have time, we'll go back.
It's just background slides. So, you
Oh,
talk
nice.
about layered landscapes, you
That's
get your canopy
beautiful.
tree, and then
Yeah.
so,
So,
that could be a lawn or it could be all of that.
right. Is that your property?
No, this is, I
Yeah.
think this is Georgia.
Okay. Well, Doug was talking about his property and it's now so full of, is it mostly shrubs and trees and ground covers now, Doug?
What is blocking the light are all of those trees we planted. They grew.
Mhm.
So I planted so many oaks from acorns. Well, they're pushing 50 feet tall now, and it's only 20 years. So people say, "Oh, oaks don't grow." They grow. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Just give us a tip about that. Well, Mary, are you there? I think we might have lost her.
she's muted. I can see.
Ah, how do we get back?
She has to.
I'm
There
good.
you
I'm
go.
good now.
Okay,
Mary,
good.
should
Yes.
we,
Yes, you did. You've actually touched on a number of questions that
uh-huh.
that have come in. But I think there are a number of questions and they'll take us in a few different directions. So if we have a person who is interested, and this goes back to the topic of keystone species, but this concern had to do with rare plants and the connection between rare plants and rare insects. So in terms of, obviously thinking about all the keystone species, to what extent is it important or necessary to think about the function of rarer plants, in
So
particular with rarer insects?
It's a great question. I think of keystone species. If I were building a house, keystone species are the 2x4s. They're essential. I can't build the house with wallpaper because it's going to fall down. But it's not the only thing I'm going to build the house out of. I need sheetrock and I need wallpaper and I need windows. And that's where those other species come in. So for example, spring beauties, at our house, it's a rare species. I know it can be really common, but we just have a few. There's a single species of bee that specializes on spring beauties. And if I don't have spring beauties, I don't have that bee. If I don't have Phacelia, I don't have Andrena Phacelii. And this is where these isolated interactions are really important when you're talking about building the total diversity of your yard. Diversity is good because it buffers the number of species in your ecosystem. If you lose a few, you've got many others to do the jobs they were doing. It's called redundancy. So the keystone plants are essential components, but they're not the only components. And you do want to diversify as much as possible so that all of those more unusual species can be there as well. And this is where people say, well, my property's not big enough to do all that. And if you have 1/8 of an acre or 1/10 of an acre, you're right, it's not. But your 1/8 of an acre, 1/10 of an acre is attached to another one, which is attached to another one. So this is where neighborhoods should be working together to enhance the local ecosystem. Somebody who's got the big oak on their property, but there's not room for anything else. Okay, they've done the oak. Somebody with bright sun can be working on the pollinator garden, and you divvy up the jobs so that within 100 square yards, you've got a lot of those jobs accomplished.
And then we have a question on, I would put it in the category of manipulating our natives. So there's this question about this idea of a Chelsea chop, or cutting back some of your perennials earlier to make them thicker. Does that practice, as a garden practice, is that harmful? Does it matter?
Well, that's a practice, again, to enhance the aesthetics of your plant. And that's okay. We do have some practices, particularly focused on neatening up the garden in the fall, that are harmful in terms of what those plants could be doing. So if you have your black-eyed Susan patch, for example, and then you cut it all back after it's done blooming, you've just removed all the seeds that your goldfinches could be eating all winter long. If you leave them there and then cut it back in March, those seeds are already gone. The goldfinches have eaten them. So the timing of these types of manipulations can be very important in terms of maximizing both the aesthetics and the function.
Doug, could you talk about that a bit more, about the cutting back the canes, how a lot of these insects like to nest in the hollows of say elderberry or blackberry canes. But I think your latest research shows that they nest in last summer's canes. So in other words, you go through one summer and you leave it up, and then you go through the next summer and you don't cut them back until what, June, July or something. That's, talk about feeling like the garden is messy, but you have some strategies for that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't want to take credit for this. This is Heather Holmes' work with native bees. Again, there are a lot of things that do lay eggs in the stalks of your goldenrod or your evening primrose, the things that look like dead plants in the wintertime. But it's the pithy center of those that is a very important overwintering site for many of our native bees. And it's not just overwintering. They successively breed in those pithy stems all summer long as well. But a lot of times, I thought for a long time that they, of course, were using the stems that were alive last summer. But it turns out, no, they go through the winter, and then the following summer is when they start to use those canes. And maybe they have to get weathered enough, I don't know. And those are the canes they will overwinter in the following winter. So this is why if you have a meadow type patch, maybe a pocket prairie, it doesn't have to be big or anything, but this is why the suggestion is that you people either mow or burn their meadows, but you only do that 1/3 of the space each year, so that any one area of your little meadow is only manipulated once every 3 years, which means for 2 years those stalks are actually standing. So if you have a little pocket prairie in your front yard, that leaves a lot of dead material that people say are ugly and they throw you out of the homeowners association. So what do we do about that? Well, Heather has also found that most of the use happens within 2 feet of the ground. So, for a plant that's 5 feet tall, you can cut off 3 feet of it. And if you do that evenly, it does reduce the unkemptness quite a bit. And then, of course, new green things grow up around that. So those dead stalks are in there when you plant densely enough, and you end up not even noticing them.
Right. And you also say something about you could bundle together, like say my elderberry. I could take those stalks and bundle them together and just put them somewhere vertically. Is that the idea? So that
That's the idea. And again, a lot of these things, nobody's actually measured how well they work, but it's logical that even the stalks of your goldenrod, if you tie them up like the corn stalk decoration on Halloween and put it in your backyard, stand it up so that it doesn't fall down. If it falls down, it's going to get wet and then start to rot. Nobody can figure out why that wouldn't work in terms of being a good resource for these overwintering bees. When we put up bee hotels, that's just a block of wood with a hole in it. That works. So it really should work.
And on that point, you suggest we don't have the great big hotel. We break up the hotel into little motels, I guess you might say.
Yes, I like that, motels. Yeah, the smaller the better, because the bees in your yard will use it, and it concentrates all the nesting in one place, which makes them vulnerable to predators and diseases. So you want to scatter it around the way it normally would be. In a normal habitat, there's coarse woody debris almost everywhere, and the bees get to space themselves out. Mm-hmm. But if you have a big fancy bee hotel that is really made to make humans happy, the bees will go there, but they're all in one place. So.
Okay, and in terms of other critters, we have questions about ticks and deer and earthworms. So in terms of ticks, the good practice, of course, is to leave the leaves, and that ticks are a part of a whole cycle. The birds are able to eat them, but on the other hand, people are concerned with ticks, and they're concerned with the diseases. So how do you think about ticks and diseases and leaves and?
Ticks are one of the downsides of nature that we have to manage, just like any other disease bearing organism. I've had Lyme disease 5 times. So I am speaking from experience, although I am lucky in that when I get a tick bite that I've missed, when a tick is feeding at me, it itches. So I know it. And if I do get Lyme disease, I get the bullseye. So I know it. I won't miss it. And I do recognize there are people who don't have those reactions and they do miss it, and that can be a real problem. But we're really talking about the ticks that carry most of the diseases, and that's the black-legged tick or the deer tick. They're very tiny. Birds aren't eating them. They're just too small to be an effective part of the food web. So understanding what has created all these ticks, how come we didn't have ticks when we were growing up? They were there, but they were so rare, they just weren't an issue. And that was because we didn't have the overpopulation of deer. It's the tick, rodent, deer cycle that enables Lyme disease to become a real issue in our landscapes. So we have a cultural issue with controlling deer, and that's why we have this disease. And until we work that out emotionally, saying, we just can't have everything. Mm-hmm. We take away the deer predators, the deer explode. It's not their fault, but every population has to be managed or there are problems. And the deer are causing a lot of problems with the understory of our forests. because they eat all the natives and leave the non-natives. They're encouraging the invasive species like crazy. They do, they're essential to that Lyme disease cycle. They kill about 1,000 people a year in car collisions. So, which is far more than are dying from West Nile disease or all these other things we get all upset about. And yet we refuse to control the deer. So we just, this is it's a societal issue that we have to get serious about. But
do you think, in light of the question, because that was the deer question, it has to do with how do you get to the point so they're not eating the understory? Do you think it's, I mean, you've mentioned that it's a cultural issue. Are you, or your feelings on the sprays and the fencing and whatever else you can do, is that something that you do?
Well, of course, we have too many deer at my house too. And we have the Bambi effect at my house too. So hunting is not allowed on our property. And we recognize this is ecologically a stupid response, but it's real and that's the way it is. So how do we grow things? I have metal cages. I should have a picture in here. The 5-foot galvanized wire that I encircle a new plant and keep it there until the plant grows beyond deer browse damage. I mean, there's always buck rub issues. So when that's the case, I wrap plastic around the trunk. But we have 10 acres. We're not going to fence the whole 10 acres. That would work, but that's a big expense and it's a big maintenance because the fence likes to fall down. So until deer populations move down to below the carrying capacity, we've got the carrying capacity is around 14 deer per square mile. We have 140 deer per square mile, 10 times over the carrying capacity, which is, it's ecologically ridiculous. But so we can protect our plants that way. I don't use the spray because I'm too lazy, for one thing. You have to go out and spray every time it rains. And there's also, I haven't done the research, but it certainly makes sense. Insects find plants through chemistry. And if you're spraying a plant and changing the chemical smell of that plant entirely, you've just eliminated its ecological function. So I don't do that. But what we do is we're vigilant during May and June. Those are the peak months of infectivity, and I know that you can get Lyme disease just about any time. But those are the months that it's really an issue. So we're very careful about checking ourselves then. It's a good time not to be rolling around in the leaves. This is, you laugh, but photographers do it all the time. They lay down on the ground and they're getting ready to take. Boy, you get ticks then. I mean, that really invites them. So when I say we should reduce the area of lawn is a functional method of reducing ticks, in that if you have broad swaths of lawn instead of 5 acres of lawn, stick to that, because the ticks crawl up on vegetation and they quest. They put their little legs out, and when you walk by, they grab onto you. They're not in the middle of your lawn. They're on the edges where you've got particularly grasses and things. So if you, particularly during those risky months, stick to those swaths of grass, you can really reduce the risk altogether. But there are big risks to avoiding nature altogether too. Emotional risks, health risks. So to me, it's worth it to have to manage this particular risk. When we go in our car and we get behind a tractor trailer going 80 miles an hour, that is risky, but we manage it. So,
how about I was going to say, the other question has to do with earthworms. How about
right.
What you say about earthworms?
Earthworms, they're not giving us diseases, but we're talking about primarily the 3 species of Chinese worms that are highly invasive. They're called jumping worms. They overwinter as egg cases, and then they hatch in the spring, and they eat all the leaf litter. They change the soil chemistry. They eat all the seeds in the soil. So in other words, they destroy the soil ecosystem, which is vital. A huge problem, and nobody knows what to do about it, including me. you don't bring these things over here, but of course we have. So what do? I wish the birds would eat them, but for some reason they sure aren't controlling them. So.
Yeah.
And then a whole nother line of question that we have are concentrated around, cultivars and nativars. And, particularly you're thinking on those, especially in the light of the fact that it's harder and harder sometimes to find straight species in nurseries, particularly for trees and smaller trees.
Yeah, that's actually changing because there is a lot of pressure on nurseries. It's not pressure, they're recognizing that there is a market for straight species. And when there's a market, the suppliers will start to meet that. It's a money-making adventure. There's a shortage of native plants around the country now. That was just published this fall. So the market has been demonstrated and people will start to respond to it. Cultivars dominated the landscape because of that notion that plants are just decorations. So you gotta have the prettiest form. So we did a study, and Annie White has done some studies. Our study focused on the structural parts of woody plants, so not flowers. So if you take a tall plant, you make it short, or if you take a green leaf and you make it red or purple, if you introduce disease resistance, if you enhance berry size, if you make the leaf variegated, what happens to the ecological value of that cultivar compared to the straight species? And so we did a 3-year experiment with Common Garden experiment with Mount Cuba Center with the straight species in the middle, surrounded by its cultivars, and then we measured insect use. And the only cultivar trait that consistently reduced insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because that loads the leaf with anthocyanins, and anthocyanins are feeding deterrents. So I was actually a little surprised about that, but it's good news in terms of function. If you have a small landscape, it really can improve the ability to get natives into your landscape if you can find smaller ones. Instead of big leggy ones, you get shorter ones. And if they maintain their ecological value, that's good news. So before I go into flowers, there's a persistent problem, and that is most of these cultivars are propagated clonally. So we're putting plants with 0 genetic variability in the landscape, and we know that's not a good idea. Particularly in the age of climate change, we need as much genetic variability as possible. So I would like to see nurseries carrying straight species, and people who are planting primarily for function can buy them. And that's starting to happen. Flowers is where most of our cultivar traits are because we want to manipulate them. Flower color and size and shape is like hemlines, changes every year, and we want people to buy new flowers. So you can buy an echinacea that looks like a zinnia, and then I guess that makes you special. I don't know. But what does that do to pollinators? Well, Annie White at the University of Vermont did her PhD on that. So if you get speakers, she'd be a good one to have. I've actually never heard her speak, but people say she's good, and she will explain all of her results. The bottom line is her news is not quite as good as ours, because when you change flower traits, you're messing with the traits that establish those specialized relationships with those native bees. Not always. Sometimes, it is certainly possible to enhance the nectar load and possibly the pollen load. They're just starting to look at what that happens to the pollen nutrition, but more often than not, those changes to flowers disrupt pollination rather than enhance it. So again, it'd be nice if you had the option of getting the straight species.
And in comparison to nativars,
well, cultivars of native plants are nativars.
Oh, okay. All righty. And then when you're sort of thinking and recommending, how concerned are you about people putting in, nativars, cultivars, and even native plants out from outside one's immediate region?
I'm probably less concerned than other people. I'm trying to reestablish food webs. So I'm trying to get that energy from the plant out to other animals. And food webs, the specialized nature of food webs is geographically usually pretty big. So for example, if I have a caterpillar that eats beech trees, it will eat beech trees, whether they're from Florida or Canada or Missouri. But if I plant a beech seed from Florida in my yard, it's going to die because it's outside the, its provenance. Its genotype is not adapted to our cold winters. So planting out, when you move plants around, meeting the needs. Boy, I am so unarticulate today. You got to meet their genetic needs. That's where provenance comes in and is important. That is more difficult to accomplish than satisfying the food web. If you're using a native plant that supports a lot of native insects, they will use it no matter where it came from, is what I'm trying to say. But stick with the latitude you have. Now, there are some real purists out there, and I'm not going to discourage that. They're worried that if you, so for example, there's a group on Long Island that works with grasses, and they're worried if you use a species from eastern Long Island and western Long Island, it's going to really wreck the gene pool because the genes will flow back and forth. We actually had a meeting with the top plant geneticists in the country. There were like 15 of them that got together for a week at Mount Cuba. I was invited. I don't know why, but I was invited there because I'm not a geneticist. And they talked about these issues because there's a whole bunch of theoretical things that could happen when you move plants out of their geographical range. But we looked at the evidence, and there's no evidence that it ever does happen. So the conclusion was it's not as big a problem as people are worried about. If you want to be a purist and only get plants from within 15 miles of where you live, that's fine. It's hard, but it's fine. But if I made that a requirement in terms of the native plant movement, nobody would do it. That would kill it. And that's not fine. So.
And we have questions about sort of trying to change your property a little bit so that you're able to put in more diversity. So one question has to do with amending sandy soil in the spring so that you could have ephemerals.
Yeah. That's fine. It's increasing the amount of work, and it's also temporary because as soon as you stop doing that, it's not going to last. Gardening is easier if you accept the conditions of where you are. You know, when I fly into Denver, it looks like Philadelphia for all the eastern trees that people have planted there, because most of the people who live in Denver now are from the east and they want it to look that way. But Denver and that whole area is a high short grass prairie with very little rainfall. And none of those trees are sustainable without supplemental water, which they don't have. So when we try to change the conditions of where we live, we create real challenges. But I understand the fun. You know, if you really want to have spring ephemerals and you want to enrich the soil, that's okay, as long as you understand what you're doing. Now, when we moved into our property here, particularly around the house, you know, the bulldozers turned everything up. It was mostly subsoil, and it was a farm that had been farmed for 300 years, and almost all the topsoil was down in the valley, down in the holler, we call it. So the soil was terrible anyway. So what I did when I planted plants was the city of Newark, Delaware, composts. They collect leaves from the street every year, and they compost them for a year. Then they put them out for people to take. And that's what I did. I planted a plant and put those, you know, composted leaves around it. And that's the only thing I did to the soil. But it was good. It really had added the mycorrhizae and all of the nutrients that were needed. I never ended up actually fertilizing anything. So I was enhancing the value, the carbon content of that subsoil I was planting into. And we've got good soil now. So it's okay.
Thank you. And I'm also looking at the clock a little bit in terms of trying to bring some closure. So just the other kinds of questions, grouping them together, come from people who have smaller properties, and they're concerned with what kinds of trees can you put in a small property, or what are the best plants for a small property? Because in fact, you don't have a whole lot of space to do huge variety with. So you're thinking about that.
Right, and that is certainly an issue. Plants require sun. Some are better in shade than others, but most blooming plants won't bloom really well unless you have sun. So if you take a small property and you put a big canopy tree in it, you're going to shade the whole thing. That's okay as long as you recognize you're going to do that. If you want to enjoy sun-loving plants and lots of blooms, you're not going to be able to do that. Small properties would be good places to focus on pollinator gardens, where you are trying to have blooming plants all season long to satisfy the needs of the pollinators. There are a number of shrubs that are really important for pollinators and don't get very big, like winterberry, like buttonbush, like clethra. These bloom in the midsummer, and that's usually a slow point for blooming plants. A lot of things bloom in the fall, and a lot of things bloom in the spring, but midsummer is tough. But plants that most people, haven't thought about, like goldenrod. Goldenrod supports 110 species of caterpillar and all those specialist bees. Really important plant. They do fine on a small property. So it's meeting, you can meet a lot of needs. You're not going to meet everybody's needs on a small property. And this is why I was talking earlier about thinking about the entire landscape. None of the wildlife using your land cares anything about your property line. So they're going to use your neighbors too. And this is why the more people that do this together, the more niches you will have to be able to fill, and the better it will work.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That, I think, sums up the bulk of our questions. So, Anne, at this point, I'm just going to turn it back to you, because you might have some additional ideas or questions.
Well, no, thank you, Mary. I think those questions are great. And really, we have used up a whole hour of Doug's time. So I'm sure we do have many more questions, but we'll have to save those for our next talk with you, or whatever. Wait for your next book. It's coming out.
Let me ask you a question. I want to ask you a question. I get questions all the time, and I was thinking of writing a book that was just Q&A and tackling misconceptions, and I could tell people to read it. You think is that an okay idea? There's really, I've got like 50 pages of questions and answers already in there. So
maybe I would put that on your website. I just see this huge need for something that is riveting for parents and children. Like, I mean, I'd volunteer to help you do something for children, because I think they're our best hope. That they're open. It's like when I think of the no smoking, Mom, put out your cigarette, or when Merlin Tuttle went around with his pet bat and kids fell in love with bats, and so they started protecting bats. It's like, I think the children are the ones we need to get excited about this. So, and if we could get you to help us do that, Anyway, I don't know what other people think.
Yeah, no, that's good. But people say go talk in schools. There are thousands and thousands of schools. I can't talk in all of them. So there's got to be a more efficient way to do it.
I think you could make a fabulous video for kids that teachers could use, and people like us could take around. Like, I could take it next door to the school, and it could have a little part about the wonderful things moths do and how your light outside is killing them, kids.
Yeah.
What can we do about that? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think you should do it, Anne.
Yeah, maybe. Well, okay. Well,
I would add, I think you should do it because we have a number of people now adding to what looks like the question and answer section that have very specific questions, and people seem to be very, very excited about that kind of a book.
Yeah. And
Okay.
we can't wait to read your oak book. That sounds like it has a lot of that sort of wonderful information in it. But
There's stuff in there.
well, Doug, I can't thank you enough. It's wonderful to talk to you and say hello to Cindy. And
I will do
I,
that.
is there any sign of spring there in your 10 acres?
You know, you can hear it in the bird songs. So the titmice and chickadee, when the sun comes out, they're starting to sing their spring songs. That's about the only sign so far.
Well, thank you so much, and take
You're
care.
welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks to all of you for listening in. Okay,
All right,
bye-bye.
well, take care.